Let's talk about what you actually can do in the field to promote healing that's non-invasive. There are 3 different techniques that I'd like to show you. Of course, you could use steri strips if you have those in your kit, but you can also just use tape. Now, going back to kind of the suturing and the duct tape technique, you know, we're not just bags of blood. You can't just cover up a hole and keep all the blood underneath the skin and that be effective. That's not the way it works. That has to be in the vessels so that it can be delivered to tissue. So you can't just seal it up and kind of have that out of sight, out of mind medical principle. That's not really a thing. You want to close it up, bring the edges of the wound closer together so that it will promote healing, but it also still needs to drain and you still need to be able to clean it. So improvising steri strips. With that, let's talk about irrigating before we go to do any of these techniques. If all you have is some disinfected water, that's all you really need. Soap and water, even better, but water at a minimum for sure is all you need. As clean a water as possible. Now, if you're in a desert environment and this is the only water you have for hydration, something that is as non-critical as a wound closure technique is not something you want to waste this water on. You need to focus on hydration as well. But if you do have some water available, then what you can do is irrigate that. And I like to irrigate with a full 32 ounce, 1 liter bottle of disinfected water. And what I'll do is I'll raise this up as high as I possibly can above the wound. And then I'll let that stream pour down into that wound. And that height gives it enough velocity and pressure to when it hits that wound, it's got enough pressure behind it to actually clean it out. And I'll do at least a full 32 ounce bottle of water, disinfected, if that's what I've got, to kind of clean that out before I close this wound up as best I can. After the wound is irrigated, then I want to I say close it up, but I want to close the edges of the wounds together. I don't want to completely close any of the wounds up because I need them to still be able to drain so I don't cause any sort of abscess, any sort of infection. So I'm going to improvise some steri strips just by taking strips of duct tape. Usually use an odd number depending on how long the laceration is. In this case I have 3. So if my wound is right here and I want to close that up, then similar to the steri strips principle, what I can do is take a piece of tape on one side, take a second piece of tape to kind of line up on the edges of the wound, and then I'll do a third piece of tape or more in the center on the opposite direction. And then what I can do is take that tape and I'll pull the top and the bottom one direction and seal it off. And this other piece of tape I'll pull the opposite direction. And if you have sweat involved here, then of course you want to dry that off as best you can. And you could add additional tape to that to close that. So these 2 were pulled this direction, this one was pulled this direction, and that closes that wound up nicely. Now if you have a lot of blood here, then you need to back up to the control the bleed portion of this. This is not a bleeding control technique. This is the bleed is under control. I'm irrigating and cleansing the wound now and closing it up to promote healing. Then I'm going to dress and bandage over top of this. But notice how I have room in between, if this laceration was running through here, to where it can still drain, but it's closed together. If for some reason, these are not completely circumferential, so if for some reason this wasn't sticking as well as I needed it to, I can take additional tape and run parallel to the bones to kind of hold those ends down. And do that on both sides to give it some extra strength. And if I need more than that, I can keep adding it parallel to the bone here until it sticks and holds like I want it to hold. And then from there, I'll dress and bandage over top of that, right? Because these are running parallel to the bone, it's not a circumferential wrap. I'm not worried about cutting circulation off, right? If I wrap completely around and it gets too tight and I have swelling from this injury, then there's a chance of reducing or stopping the circulation down below, distal to that, and that's not what I'm going for. So that is just a simple improvised steri-strip technique with basically pulling in opposing directions to bring that wound closer together. All right, so improvised steri-strips is probably the simplest way to close that wound.